I'm chair of Group Accidents. I want to thank all the members of SAHAS who have attended talks, and their contribution, their fees, have gone towards Blue Plaques. And I want to thank the President, Dr. John Morwood, and John Mead, who have taken up the baton. John has done 2 talks, and John Mead is going to do another talk. And it's our 5th plaque which is going up to Percival Blow on the 17th, 12 noon, outside the Skipton Building Society. And then John on the 26th is going to give a talk, which will follow up on, of course, his contribution to the SAHAS book on Percival Blow. So, sorry, disgusted. Sorry. A new book has come out this September. It's the story of Russia. Some of you will know the author, Orlando Figes. Now, Orlando was interviewed quite recently about the book, and he was asked, what did you think about the 24th of February this year? And he said, I was shocked, disgusted, and dismayed. And that's exactly how I felt. I was shocked because I never thought it was going to happen. And I'd actually had lunch with a Russian friend of mine a fortnight before. And I said, what's going on? Oh, it's leverage. Putin is using leverage with NATO, and that's what it's about. And then he actually invaded. Sorry, special military operation. But as some of you will know, my background is in anthropology as well as history. And I had, as that happened on the 24th, I had to do something. And I wrote an article. Which is on my blog, rather long article, which was really about why. What on earth is going on? So the making of war, and in this particular case, Russia and Ukraine, is being of great significance to me to try and understand why. So tonight's talk is going to be a bit of anthropology and a bit of history, and trying to understand some of it you will have already read about, or you will studied about, or you will have thought about. But I'm going to try to put it together. Now, back in 1931, Albert Einstein was approached by the Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. And they said to him, we'd like you to have a conversation with any other intellectual you'd like to choose. It didn't take Albert long to think about who he wanted to talk to. And in fact, it evolved into a series of letters. And the person he wanted to talk to was Sigmund Freud. And he asked Sigmund Freud, why war? What is it about the human species? He came to the conclusion that human beings were full of hatred, and we actually had a collective psychosis. Now, I think actually it's not quite like that. It's not a collective psychosis, but it is something unique to our species, Homo sapiens. Now, we know that many animals can be violent. Our cousins, chimpanzees, 99% the same DNA as us, can be very violent. They can attack other groups, they can kill, they can even eat other chimpanzees. They can be very, very violent, but they don't make war, because war is organized. And as Einstein said, what is it that enables devices, he called them, whether it's racism, nationalism, religion? What is it that makes us capable of killing other people and sacrificing our lives for a cause which is not personal? Young men and young women giving up their lives for an idea, a concept. So what is that? Where does that come from? Some of you will know the academic, Christopher Coker. He's just written a book called The Making of War. And he comes to the startling conclusion in this that it's actually natural for human beings to make war. That is not an aberration, which we would like it to be. He traces it back to the idea of storytelling. Because a story is something that can influence our minds and make us take an action which goes beyond instinctive, reactive behavior. It's a thought-through process. Coker imagines our prehistoric ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, sitting around a fire, telling stories. What are those stories about? About our past. They're about history, because history is, of course, a story. So whereas anthropologists, we study behavior, historians study what human events took place in the past. Or perhaps they didn't. When I was a student in 1969, a book came out which many of you will know, J.H. Plum, The Death of the Past. And what Plum put forward was every age, every group of tribes, because we're a tribal species, construct their own history to reinforce their institutions, their culture, their social patterns. So we make history, and we make history every age. That's why when I was studying long time ago classics, someone said, "Oh, how can you study ancient history? It's so long ago, hasn't it all been done? Hasn't it all been written?" But of course, every age examines it, re-examines it, reassesses it, puts their own culture on it. When I was a child, long time ago, when I was a child, there were books about the empire. The books were about what a great job we've done, how we brought civilization to people. Now, think about that in today's context, and it's seen as colonialism, as in fact an abomination. So things change, analysis change. But in terms of writing history, what is it then that enables us to persuade people to go to war and sacrifice their lives? If we take it beyond the anthropology, actually what's happening, let's look at the history of Russia and how context takes us to the thoughts of Vladimir Putin. Last July 2021, Putin wrote an article. And you can get it on the internet, you can read what he says. And he talks about, in this article, the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. And it's a wonderful piece of history. He goes right the way through the history of Ukraine, from the Rurik dynasty, the Rus people, the Kievan, was Kiev as we would now say, era, the princes of Novgorod, and so on. And his aim is to prove that there is no difference between Ukrainians and Russians. And furthermore, the idea of a nation state of Ukraine is total nonsense. Or a part of Russia. Now, if you can go back to 988, what happened in 988 was that Vladimir the Great adopted Christianity. The prince, the king of Kiev, adopted Christianity. And that was a key moment for Russia, because Christianity wasn't just about a nation, it was about a culture, the Orthodox culture. This was reinforced, oddly, by a disaster. The disaster was 1453, which was the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. It was the end of Byzantium, or as the Byzantines saw themselves, because that nomenclature is a modern nomenclature. Byzantines saw themselves as Romans. Though they spoke Greek, they called themselves Romaioi. They were Romans. It was the continuation of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, it had all come to an end. But had it? The Russians saw themselves as belonging to Rome because they had adopted the Orthodox Church. And they thought of themselves as the Third Rome, an empire which was not based on a nation state, was based on a culture, on an idea, the Orthodox idea. So in 1547, Ivan IV, who will you remember as Ivan the Terrible, took the title of Tsar, which is just Caesar, of all the Russias. Not one Russia, of all the Russias, because Russia is an empire, not just a nation state. Now you can see where this is leading to in Putin's thinking. Russia isn't confined by nationalism. It is a way of life, it is a culture, it is the Orthodox culture. And Ukraine is referred to as the Ukraine, which just means the border area. And when they're being nice, little Russia. Ukrainians are little Russians. They're all part of this wonderful, massive empire. The Tsar, and incidentally, there was a good connection because Ivan IV's father, Ivan III, was married to Sophia Palaiologos, the niece of the last emperor of Constantinople, Constantine XI. So the connection between Byzantium and Russia and the idea, the concept of this being the Third Rome, the Roman Empire goes on. It doesn't come to an end with the fall of Constantinople, is imbued within Russian history. The Tsar is the father of the people. Very paternalistic. The Tsar has to sign off all marriage certificates. Big job, right the way through. He has this autocratic, total power. And it's not just secular. He is the head of the Orthodox Church. It's not that he has any understanding of theology, and of course Constantine the Great found that at Nicaea unproblematic, because it's not the theology, it's the appointments to the head of church. This is why Putin is like that with the present patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. And Kirill, sounds very un-Christian, is all in favor of the war because it's orthodoxy. And just over a year and a half ago, the Church of Ukraine, the Orthodox Church, because Ukraine, of course, is quite split because of the different movements. And the Western part is much more Catholic and involved closer because also the population is Polish. But the Church of Ukraine has now become Catholics. It is broken away from Moscow. It is free. It caused lots of ructions. But you can see how Putin would see that as another resentment. Now, how has Putin marshaled this? In his thinking. He's laid out his history. He's laid out the Ukraine as part of Russia. And he blames two people, or two ideas, I should say. He blames the West, and he blames communism. He's not a communist. He's an autocrat. He has unlimited powers, as the Tsar did. He has this paternalistic role that he must look after all the Russian people, and that includes Ukraine. So although in the Western press we talk about the reasons for the war, NATO pressing to close, neo-Nazis running the Ukrainian government, the sometimes insulting fact that the Ukrainians don't have their own language, it is the dialect of Russian and they're little poor Russians, and so on. But in reality, what is driving this is the story that the Ukraine, is actually part of the Russian whole. And it has no rights to be independent. And it's been seduced by the West. And the West is the enemy. And every good dictator, from Peter the Great, from Catherine through to Stalin, to Brezhnev, everybody needs an enemy. That's how you galvanize and hold Russia together. And of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the comical President Yeltsin took place, the Russians lost their pride. They lost that sense of we are a great empire, a superpower. And what Putin has been doing steadily is developing his resources to recover it. In the West, we're blind for very good reasons. Democratic countries, and the last thing we want is war. We saw that in the Second World War. We let Hitler march into the Rhineland. We allowed him to take over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. We allowed Hitler a lot of laxity because we were terrified of repeating the First World War. Democracies want peace. We don't spend enough on defense. Of course we don't, because we want to raise living standards of our citizens and so on. This is not the case in more totalitarian states, where the Russians, for example, have always seen war as a solution to a problem, not the problem itself. We stood by when Putin invaded Georgia and Abkhazia. We stood by. South Ossetia, taken away. We didn't worry, too far away. And they had that rather crazy Kashishvili trying to join NATO and so on. Interestingly, Kashishvili, of course, then went to Ukraine, took Ukrainian citizenship, but that's another story. But then, what did we do over the Crimea? Oh, a few sanctions. The writing was on the wall. I can say that now with hindsight, though I was equally shocked on the 24th of February when it actually all happened. Dictators, autocrats can push, and democracies generally fall back. Now, the situation is we've woken up, we've understood, we've realized that Putin may not stop there. Of course, there's another awful dimension, which is nuclear weapons and the impact that could possibly have on the rest of us, the rest of the world, and so on. So we're living under huge amounts of stress. On the other hand, we might feel at the moment, rather tentatively, that the news is good. Dictators don't always get their way, and the Russian army is proving to be, despite its size, despite all its resources, fairly shambolic. But that's a wishful thinking, of course. We don't know really what's going to happen. Behind this making of war, then, what we have is the problem of the story and the ideology. And the ideology here is to support the autocracy, the ultimate control of Putin. Now, what would happen if Putin goes? Do we really think naively that there wouldn't be another Russian to replace him, who thinks in the same way, another Russian leader who has the same attitude to the Ukraine and to the empire of Russia, how it will compete against the West? Putin likes to compare himself with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Some people say, oh, he's more like Stalin. They're all the same ilk. My belief is that nothing has changed the political culture of Russia since Ivan the Terrible? Well, you might say, well, there was a revolution. 1917. The Tsarist regime went. The Tsarist regime overturned by communism. But the structure remained the same. You had the autocratic figure, and then if anything went wrong, who did you blame? Well, in Tsarist Russia, the father of the people was always right, but he was surrounded by bad nobility. They were the people to blame. They got it wrong. If anything went wrong, the buck was easily passed. In the Soviet Union, it was the apparatchiks. It was the bureaucracy. The leaders got it right. The Politburo was there. The autocrat, from Stalin right the way up to Andropov, all had the same attitude. They were good, they were looking after their people, and it was the bureaucrats. Putin moved in power. Who were the baddies? It was the oligarchs at the blame. And if you crossed him, Khodorkovsky, for example, put on trial and you were finished. I used to travel to Russia quite a bit for universities I worked for. We were always trying to create links, and if I'm honest, always trying to, of course, find students who were going to pay fees. And I went to the Free University in Moscow one time, and I was with my Russian colleague who came out, and he said, "You see that building across there? And there's a rather fine building across from the university." He said, "That's the building where Putin's accountants and prosecutors work. And if he doesn't get his fair share, they will get you." A whole system set up to bring the oligarchs in, and if they misbehave, they're out. And of course, it can be out with a disaster. Some of you will remember the oligarch who supported Putin initially, Berezovsky, who came to the UK. Interesting enough, some of you may have seen the new table of corruptions come out, countries that are corrupt. We're 11th. And it's mainly because we let Russian money in. It's the City of London, and we should be higher. But anyway, that's an aside. But Russian oligarchs coming to the UK, some of them fleeing. A remarkable number of them have had accidents. And we still don't know whether Berezovsky committed suicide or not. I'm personally suspicious because we have the example of Litvinenko. We know what happened there. The Skripals, we know what happened there. Russia hasn't changed, is my point. That you can change the name on the door, but the culture, the political culture, is exactly the same. And it's about centralized control. It's about dictatorship and autocracy. It's about paternalistic infallibility. And it's about hardness and brutality. No one fights a war like the Russians. Consistently, they have allied their tactics and their strategy in war with their political ambitions. Some of you may have been surprised at the brutality that has taken place in Ukraine. I was expecting. When you saw what they did in Chechnya, when you saw even in Georgia what they did, flatten everything and punish the population who will not give in. Very different from military strategy in the West and the tactics in the West, where you're trying to win over the population. You're trying to support a population, particularly in wars where it's involved some terrorism or so on. This is not military strategy in Russia. Russian generals, Russian soldiers don't have that subtlety. It's destroy everything, and we've seen that in Ukraine. So where are we going with this? What am I saying? I'm saying that in anthropological terms, we humans have created, and this is where I can't disagree with Chris Coker, we've created a normality about violence, which we've organized in a human way. Now, if you want to be positive about it, what you can say is human beings have learned to cooperate. It's what made us great. And that's through language and through ideas and the fact that we have imagination. Animals don't have imagination. As far as we can tell, they live from moment to moment. We can worry about the future. And we can even worry about the past. We can stress ourselves out by worrying about something that's not actually happened or something that did happen. It's a great gift, but it's also, of course, carries the burden. But it also allows us to communicate our ideas, our thoughts, and then we can cooperate. And by cooperation, we've created civilization. Good, some would say. But we can do things. We are an advanced species. It enables us to make war, to organize, and, if you like, let's use this term, brainwash a whole generation into believing that the idea is more important than their life, and that they should pursue that idea come what may. So, in anthropological terms, violence has been a way of advancing our culture. Some of you will remember the film 2001, our own Stanley Kubrick. There's a scene in that which I put on one of my blogs because it haunted me at the time, and I remember it. And then I started reading, when I was getting interested in anthropology, Robert Ardrey, who was a populist writer about anthropological things. There was an Australian anthropologist, Raymond Stark, who uncovered in South Africa an early form of Australopithecine, a species that comes before Puma. And in this cave where he found this Australopithecine, there were animal bones and there were human bones, but it was clear the animals had been killed violently. Now, Robert Ardrey developed this new book, and it appears in 2001. You may remember, of course, not many of you are old enough to have seen that film, but you may remember there's a scene where two groups of ape-like creatures come together. They're shouting and yelling and blah, blah. In fact, they were human beings dressed in skins. I mean, amazingly. Anyway, one of them picks up a bone and throws it up. And of course, it then moves into the obelisks that we find. It's the hint that violence moved us forward. And Raymond Stark, the anthropologist, said, look, this is what has made us advance. Whenever we get into violent situations or wars, our technology improves. It has to. Our travel to space depends on German rockets made to land on London. That's where it all came. So there's another side to this. Of course we hate war. We don't want needless killing, but Chris Coker's not entirely wrong. There's a natural element in the development of the human species that has enabled us to channel that violence and give us some advantages from it, despite the terrible consequences of people losing their lives. So the anthropology is interesting. But there's no one coherent theory of evolution in those terms. So it may not be that Raymond Stark was right. It may be that there are other things that enabled us to develop civilization. Correlations are not true. Where does that leave us then? The history side. The history side is going back to Plum, is we're inventing our past. Aitken Taylor said about the Second World War, we got what we deserved in Churchill. Because Churchill, in his speeches, constantly reiterated how we would never be defeated, how we were a nation that would always overcome. Is it a myth? Is it true? Nations create myths about themselves in the same way that we now create slogans about things. I was reminded of a slogan that I used to teach quite often in Northern Ireland, and I heard it all the time. And I was reminded today because, of course, King Charles III is in Northern Ireland. No surrender. I would travel across and I'd see this written, and then you'd see the murals, as they were called, not the murals, the murals of each side, expounding, delineating, announcing myths, stories for each side. And that's what we do. Call it propaganda, we can call it what it is, or we can call it national pride or patriotism. And I'm still delighted that the English cricket team were able to defeat South Africa the other day. Gave it a big round of applause. So we're all brought along by that. And Putin has had that. And it's not just him, it's embedded within the Russian people. Of course, there are many Russian moderates. Not that there are many, not in prison now, but there are Russians there who don't accept that and want to move to a more civil and democratic society. But what I have learned as an anthropologist is that cultures take a long time to change. We cannot expect something to happen overnight. And if we balance it, we know that in Ukraine, there is corruption, extreme nationalism, and Russian-speaking peoples are concerned about a nationalistic government. It's happened in the Baltic states. For example, in Estonia, or Lithuania, or Latvia, you can't be a member of that parliament unless you can speak Lithuanian, Latvian, or Estonian. So they are asserting their nationalism. And we see it in our own society now, whether it's independence of Scotland, or whether it's a feeling there should be independence for Wales, or Cornwall even. There is that sense we buy into the story about who we are and what we should have. And it's always easier, isn't it, to blame the other. And what Putin has done now has blamed the other in a massive way. The West is out to get Russia. They're out to get us. And our only way of defending ourselves is to act first. And you've seen that also in China, and it's very worrying. But dictators have that power. They can control the media. They can control school textbooks. They can control people's thinking. That's what happens. And we all know, we examine our own thoughts, how we certainly accept certain things, which may not necessarily be true. So, to finish, what am I going to say then? I'm going to say we must be aware that however rational we think we are as human beings, we are actually driven by emotions. Some of you will know about Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is a Jewish American economist who won the Nobel Prize for Economics because he explained how emotion drives economics. You'd think money, something to do with, we'd be the most rational people of all. This is about money, this would be very rational. But in fact, the stock exchange, exchanges around the world are not rational at all. And it's got even worse now because they're all linked up by computer. They only have to press one button and everything goes into red. But it's not true. There is no such thing as money. There is no such thing as a nation. These are all human concepts that we have created and invented, and we shape according to our views and our needs, but not reality. That is what Putin has done. He shaped culture in Russia based on existing society and used it to his own advantage, apparently. However, we've seen it happen before, and I think we may see it again. Dictatorships inevitably have a lifetime span which is limited. Whether Russia can change and make that leap is uncertain. It had the opportunity in 91, Yeltsin, but because of the economic collapse and perhaps the farcical presentation of the president himself, it was not sustainable. What we can hope for, though, in terms of history, is that Putin will fail. Thank you very much.
Jim, that was a wonderful tour de force, very, very enlightening, and no PowerPoint presentation, no notes. Awesome. Sir, I'm sure Hannah, I can see there's loads of questions coming in. Can I just fire one at you? You talked about this concept of the Ruses and Putin's expansionism. We know that in the days of the Tsars, you know, they didn't stop there. They looked at Poland, they went into the Balkans. If he is successful in Ukraine, is that his next step?
Logically, yes, in the sense that his initial drive is to recover and restore a Russian empire. Not as a Soviets, not as a communist, but as a culture, the Orthodox culture. And the concerns of the Baltic states, of Poland, and all of those countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc must be taken seriously. Because they say he pushed Georgia, he did, that's enough. He took Crimea, well, they were mainly Russian speaking, it's a long way away, did nothing. I think now we've had the wake-up call. It will be extremely difficult for him. Finland have joined NATO. They recognize they're right on the border. That would be a problem. So I think it will be very difficult to go forward. But in his thinking, I'm sure when he started out, yes, this is just the beginning. Back to the Russian Empire. I must tell you this story because it's very, very indicative. When I was doing my work in Russia, I went to the University of Rostov. Rostov is actually not that far away from the place. And I went to the university and I was taken up to meet the rector. We went in and there was a big reception area and it said in Russian, "Welcome to the University of Warsaw." I said, "What's this?" Well, prior to the First World War, Russia ruled Poland and they established the University of Warsaw. And when the Russians weren't doing so well in the First World War, and the Germans and the Austrians were advancing, the university had to up sticks. And it did a grand tour around Russian cities until someone, the good fathers of Rostov, said, "You can stop here." But they haven't changed. They're still thinking about it. And just to follow that, when I first went to Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, I took the underground. The underground doors, just above them, they had a map with a hammer and sickle over it. It was the whole world. It wasn't just Russia. And that's the thinking. It's a culture for the whole world. This is the sense of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the world. Sorry, long answer.
Oh, great answer, though. Great answer. Any questions on the floor, please? Guys, how are we managing this? Sandy first.
Tim, thank you very much. That was extraordinarily fascinating, but it was quite a Western liberal perspective. And just a comment, I mean, I've been quite surprised. I have friends, well, a couple of friends from Hungary who I, have a sort of perfectly normal relationship, and we talk about different things. And I just asked them about Ukraine and the current situation, and they're remarkably equivocal. And their view of the Ukrainians is that they're a bunch of crooks. One of them said, I was always scared when I saw a Ukrainian car near my town. And they sort of feel, well, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Now, I'm not defending their point of view, but I think it is very striking. It is not Russia versus the world. There are other countries which are, shall we say, being a bit more nuanced. I mean, China, obviously, India. And, I think there's a sort of bigger conflict happening here.
I think it's a fair point. We're fully on the side of Ukraine, aren't we? The poor little Ukraine thing. But of course, if you were a Russian speaker living in Ukraine and you knew that the Azov brigade were coming that way, you would be frightened. And there is a Nazi fascist element existing in Ukraine. The real issue, though, and the turnaround in this is Ukraine votes for the first time, probably without too much corruption, for Zelensky, who is Jewish. And then he's called neo-Nazi, and this was the opportunity for Ukraine to turn around. All these Eastern Bloc countries have lived with corruption because that's how it works in a paternalistic society, which is not a meritocracy. You have to go to the godfather to get what you want. So there is an element, yes, and certainly my Russian friends are totally equivocal about it, but I think you're right, there are others who are more concerned. And there is some prejudice about Ukraine because it was seen as an uncivilized part of Russia. The little Russia wasn't that civilized. So it's a fair point, but I would say it's 9-3, not 6-6.
Tony Burke, you'll notice, folks, I'm not repeating the questions because apparently we've had a technical innovation and everybody can hear on Zoom through that microphone. So.
Interesting comment. Thank you, John. Thank you so much, Tim. It was fascinating. It's so difficult for us here, so far away, culturally as well as geographically, to try and make sense of what's happening. That's very useful. I want to ask a simple question, straightforward question. And this has been puzzling me for some time. I just have no idea what to say about it, really. And that is, what happens if Putin uses 1, 2, 3 tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? What is the reaction in the West? What do you see as the reaction?
That's a really interesting, difficult question to answer. You've got to imagine yourself in the war room, and it will be in America, deciding what you do. And this is quite interesting in terms of presidential things. We think about Obama and Syria and how he was pushed and always slipped back, wasn't quite prepared. The Russians, of course, stepped in because they were prepared. And they had a base and they wanted to. But to get to your point, I don't know what the answer is. There's no easy answer to that. But if we have to learn the lesson again and again that we cannot give in to bullies, whether it's any dictator, whether it was Hitler or whether it's Putin, if we give an inch, they will take that mile. And I guess it means that there would have to be a response. The problem, the danger is always with this whole nuclear area is the accident and whether that triggers off something disastrous. But I don't know. So just
Peter Bolton.
Okay, so sitting in a pub in Kharkiv in March 2014, having just emerged from the Crimea, we were approached by a young chap, early 20s, who was beside himself with anger and uncertainty and confusion over what the Russians were doing and what they were then threatening to do. As we now know, they followed through to the Donbass. His mother had gone to stay with relatives in Russia because she was firmly in support of the Russians. But he and his dad had stayed. And he said he was willing to fight to defend Ukraine, even though he was a Russian speaker. And it set me thinking over the last few months, what will the war in Ukraine, what impact will that have on Russian speakers in Ukraine? I'm sure it varies, and on those Russians living inside Russia who can still access information through social media about what's going on if they choose to do so.
Well, the paradox is, isn't it, that what Putin has done is actually created a massive amount of Ukrainian nationalism. He's actually made them feel proud of being Ukrainian in a way that probably wasn't the case before. I don't have the inside knowledge people to get right into those minds. But what you can see happening is Ukrainians coming together to defend their nation. Again, this concept, willing to give up their lives and being passionate about it. And I suspect Putin's intelligence was, oh, well, we'll seize Kiev, topple the government, and everybody will just fall in line. And that was a big mistake. And of course, unlike Georgia, Ukraine had boundaries on the west where it could be supplied very quickly. And also, of course, refugees could escape. So, and Zelensky, not only an actor, but a producer, understood the power of theatre and the media, and there he was, talking to everybody and raising the profile of Ukraine, so that we were all touched by that and by this Goliath-David struggle seemed to be happening. And also, and this is, I guess, your point, Sandy, also about our Western idea about what should be happening in terms of democracy. We know we can get it wrong. There are societies where you can't just impose democracy just like that. It's a big cultural change you need to operate. But I'm not sure. I think, Peter, I think a lot of Russian speaking people in the area around the Donbass, and this is not based on a lot of hard evidence, it's more of a feeling, are disillusioned with what has happened because of the brutality and the destruction and a lack of care for them. This hasn't been a Russian army coming to liberate them. It's been a Russian army coming to squash them. And I think that will have turned Russian speakers more to Ukraine, where they might have felt the propaganda previously, oh, well, you're the minority and you're going to get persecuted and you're going for a bad time. What it will do, I think, for the young people of Russia, those that have access to social media, will have a different story from the Putin story. But of course, they're less politically active. But it will be interesting to see what happens. Something has to happen to Putin first, and it may happen. We hear today, even though his supporting bloggers are beginning to turn against him and so on. So it will be a general's coup. That's what happens with dictatorships. Sometimes they fail, like with Erdogan. Sometimes they're successful.
Great. I'm going to, because I've had a question on Zoom, folks, so I'm going to do that first. And then I'm going to go for Brian, Geraint, Jenny. Yeah. So the question on Zoom is from Graham Thomas, Tim. It says, what conclusion do you think the Chinese will draw from the military weakness which Russia has displayed in this war?
Good question, yes. The Chinese have been very careful, haven't they? They're not really wanting to get involved in this. For the Chinese government, all that's important is the economy. The reason the economy is so important is what holds China together. We think of China as some homogenous, 92 different languages going on in China, different groups of people. And again, it's a centralized state that lives on the idea of the greatness of China. But the greatness of China is now also linked to the economy. As long as people have jobs and they're becoming more prosperous, they will support government. Not to worry too much about the personal liberties they've lost, the lack of human rights, and so on. Once that starts going down, economy not working well, then there would be social unrest. And you have to remember the scale of China. Your just average city in China is 8 million. So if something goes wrong there, then it's serious. And we know what they did at Tiananmen Square. That was their last, but that was young students. It wasn't the working population. And the working population, if they haven't got bread on their table and a good-looking economic future, then that can be problematic. So the Chinese have, I think, been very, very, very careful. They're taking Russian oil, taking Russian gas. They're even paying in rubles. They're prepared to do that. But we've seen no hint of big arms shipments. We've seen no hint of offering international brigade, Chinese troops, and so on. And I don't think they will do that. I think they will stand back and watch. And the Chinese government, like, of course, most countries, they're very good at looking after themselves and what they can do. And they've got another issue. They've rattled the saber over Taiwan. But Taiwan is so well defended with the alliance with America, it will be a very big nut for them to crack. So the attention on that, they want to deliver on it. It's part of their manifesto of all one China. But on the other hand, I think it keeps them at bay. They have to think very carefully about what their next moves are. But the economy is key. They don't want the West to stop buying this stuff.
Great, thank you. Geraint.
Oh, I see. Tim, thank you very much. Wonderful lecture, absolutely wonderful. And I think I've come to the view personally, there's a hopeful end to this because you have described the destruction of past dictatorships, the changes that have taken place in the world, and what is happening with the Russian myth has its seeds of defeat and its seeds of decay already. I think we're beginning to feel that. So I think I'm ending my own appearance here tonight by leaving optimistically. But I just wanted to say too, that we have troubles of the kind you as an anthropologist would see. We have problems even in Britain that you could apply to some of your arguments. Scotland, once out. And it's a very clear example. And we've had Ireland, our own problem of the 3 centuries. I just wanted to tell you about an example of your use of Rostov. And with Ireland, you see, the Irish have hated the English, and particularly the English, for hundreds of years. And we know the whole history of the movement. And in 1919, they gained independence. They hate royalty. They hate Cromwell. They hate the king, King Billy. And but the answer, partly to what you said about sentiment, etc., is that the Irish architects call themselves the Royal Institute of Irish Architects. They didn't get rid of royalty. They've kept this symbol of continuity that you referred to, that I'm sure happened when you told us that example from Rostov. Thank you.
I would say that yes, I was going to say no, there would be some. I mean, this is, yes, and it's interesting. And I think with open democratic societies, you've got influences coming in. This is the whole point. You're not enclosed. And the myths that you create disappear. And there will always be, and even in Scotland, in the sense that they somewhat independent, and they're probably the most vociferous. But there will be a lot of people who will actually defy Daniel Cardeman's argument, and they will use logic and say, would our economy be better off? Would we be better off if we're independent, and so on? So it's not a monotheme at all when it comes to actually looking at how society reacts. And the more open we are as a society, and particularly we are because of the way media contact all of us, the more ideas we can have. And one of the problems engaged with Russia now is that it's become the closed society. It's difficult to get access to understand what liberal thinkers are saying because they have no way of communicating with us. So we do need to put out feelers. One of the things that impressed me as a child, which I thought was absolutely wonderful, was the way, and I give this as to the Americans, full part, the way we were persuaded to act for Germany after the Second World War, in contrast to the way we had behaved in the First World War. The Marshall Plan, the openness, supporting of democracy, changed German society. Of course, it made it very difficult for them. But it's interesting now when you look at the Western countries arming Ukraine, America comes first, Germany comes second, and we're third, the UK third. But that's a measure of how Germany has grown in its own individual confidence, but also how it wasn't punished and destroyed in the same way that we tried to after the First World War. And I think we have to think about that in terms of Russia. If Russia changes, we must be in there helping Russia develop a more democratic society.
Let me just deal with that particular issue that raised some concerns here. I'm sure all points are valid, but no intention was made to express opinions that might have led to offence. I'm right in that, Karen, aren't I? Brilliant. Brian, sir, you had a question.
I have paid myself.
It's actually not a question. I'm really trying to support Tim, because Tim was talking about how the culture within Russia hasn't changed. And in fact, we might look at Putin and say, oh, God, an awful bastard he is, etc., etc. But that's what the Russians have had for hundreds of years, from Ivan the Terrible onwards. They've had a strong man or a strong woman at the top, hitting them on the head. That's what they respect. And, you know, if you're going to look at Vladimir Putin, compare him to Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. For God's sake, there's no comparison. If you're a Russian, there's Boris Johnson or Liz Truss walking out of 10 Downing Street on a lectern, and there's Vladimir Putin marching through some Catherine's Hall in some, in the Kremlin. It's a different world to them. And the other thing to think about is how he's capitalized on the Russians' fear of the West, as you said. In the beginning of the 1600s, the Russians know the West would invade Russia every 100 years. They know. In the beginning of the 1600s, Poland swept in and sacked Moscow. In the early 1700s, it was Sweden who swept in. 1812, guess what? What happened? Napoleon swept in. 100 years later, 1914, the Germans swept in. They're waiting. Every 100 years, the Russians know the West would invade. And so Putin has capitalized on this. So I'm supporting you totally. The culture in Russia, whatever happens, communism or capitalism, whatever, the culture has not changed.
And to maintain power, introducing paranoia is a good thing. That's what's happened. The paranoia is, you're quite right, I think, Brian, in terms of the sense that they're exposed, Russia's exposed. And yes, they have a strong man, and it's strong rulers that they've been used to, so that's embedded. When you really want to understand a culture, society, the best place to go is a school textbook. That would tell you what thinking is, and that's how you inculcate your culture into the next generation. And that's key. And it's interesting in terms of the arguments that happen over school textbooks. With the breakup of Yugoslavia, new textbooks being written for the schools, and they were giving a completely different gloss on what had actually happened in the Balkans. And of course, they were mainly nationalistic. In some cases, it got to the situation, for example, both in Zagreb, Belgrade, where academics from universities were brought together to cleanse the language, obviously in Croatia, cleanse the Serbian, and in Serbia, cleanse Croatian and bring in proper languages. I see my wife is shaking her head and saying, no, you're wrong. But basically that was the idea that our nationalism made us different and separate. And that's what's happening in Russia now. The Russians are separate from the West. They don't want to be like the West. And yet, of course, we don't do, because the West also represents freedom and prosperity.
Jenny, and then our friend at the end there.
Sorry.
Jenny Burley.
Okay. Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm very struck by the different way that Gorbachev is seen in the West and in Russia. And I just wanted to ask you if you thought there was ever a point where he could have, or he or someone like him, could have changed the Russian story you've been telling us, or if actually there are far too many more steps to come before Russia is able to have a different story.
Yes, it's for Gorbachev. Yes, I mean, failed between peace, but also collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union is now the theme that Putin puts forward. We must restore it. We must restore the power, the prestige, our superpower status. That must be restored. Could things have been different? Possibly, yes. I think certainly in the West, the general attitude with when Yeltsin resisted and stopped the coup, the White Building, and so on, the feeling was things are going to change. This is not. But it's a bit like Iraq. The infrastructure that actually underpins the politics is critical. And you knew in Iraq when it was the Americans take the blame for this, went in and said, we're going to get rid of all Ba'athists. They got rid of the infrastructure, they got rid of the general. That infrastructure is incredibly important. And I don't think Yeltsin could manage that. And that infrastructure collapsed. And what happened was the oligarchs left it for they created the same structure, just in a different way. So the aristocrats, which were replaced by the apparatchiks, were replaced by the oligarchs. But that level is incredibly important. So we focus on Putin, but actually it's that level underneath that really needs to change. And whether that could have been done by Gorbachev, I honestly don't know. But you're right, the view the West has is this man of peace who's actually moving the world forward and could deal with Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher and so on. But the Russian view now, and I think it's probably with hindsight more than at the time, is that he was a disaster. And Russian greats lost it. So he's a divisive figure, yes. Yeah.
Great. Final question, Frank. Gentleman with his hand up on the penultimate row.
Thank you very much. An excellent talk. Thanks for it again. My name's Stephen Irving. My question is this: you've laid great emphasis on the enduring and powerful effects of culture, and of course, as an anthropologist, that's your primary field. We can see it around us. In the last week, following the sad death of the Queen, we have expressed ourselves in a way that it itself perpetuates and is an echo of previous cultures. But those things surely only survive because there are objective conditions of geography, of economy, or whatever it might be, that sustain those traditions. And rather than laying all the emphasis on the enduring culture in Russia or here, is there not a case to say it's the culture survives because the conditions survive? Sometimes the culture produces those conditions and there's an interaction. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
That's a good point. I think there isn't, you're quite right, there's an interaction. But it goes back almost to the Daniel Kahneman thing. We would think we're so rational and we're driven by what is rational, and we adapt in that way. Under anthropology, or evolutionary anthropology, is all about adaptation. But the emotion is actually what's still powerful and drives us. Let me give you my classic one. Some of you will have heard this before. classic one I use with students. Road rage. Road rage. What is road rage? Someone comes along, calls you up on the road. What is the rational thing to do? Get away from that mad driver, whatever you do. But what do? Shake our fists. Sometimes it's even worse, sue the car. It's even led to deaths. We react in the fight or flight mechanism. And it's usually fight in the car because, and it's usually men, of course, because of their testosterone, they're incompetitive. That competitive element exists in evolution, is there. It's the survival of the fittest. We're out there, and how dare that person, whatever they did in their car, carve me up and insult my thing. The biggest cause of war, this goes back to the Romans, is someone attacked my honor. That's what it's about, fundamentally, which is extraordinary. So I'm not entirely disagreeing with you, Stephen, but I think there's an element where there's an interaction, but we should never underestimate our emotions. And our emotions, I think, create the world that we live in. It's a bit like, anthropologists often ask, why do we have these small babies that are premature born? So demanding, what's that? The evolutionary advantages, premature birth of our babies allows their brains to develop. And if you imagine them a bit like a computer, they're programming themselves. So when they're looking around, babies are programming themselves. But the world they're seeing is not a reality, it's their programmed world. So we can see things differently. So there's an interaction between the reality of things, the institution, the structure, whatever, and our emotional reaction to them. And that's why I started off by saying, we can shape our own history. We shape our history through our culture. And we adapt that. So what is fascinating is if we think about now with the Queen's death and all the arrangements, we've got a medieval set of rituals which were designed so that no one could step in and throw the next ruler, king, out. It all happens quite quickly. When Andropov died in the Soviet Union, we didn't know about his death until almost 3 weeks after it. Because inside the Politburo, there was an argy-bargy of who's going to be next. Here, it's quite clear. We've got Tsaritsyn, but we need to install straight away. And it's sort of, for younger generations, it's weird because this is a very medieval process that's going on. And all these proclamations here, there, and everything. We've heard it once, we have heard it. How many times have we got to hear it? What's going on? But that's the shape of our constitution, the way we've shaped it. So everybody's playing ball at the political level. That's what we have to do. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I think I've gone off in a tangent, but I think you see where I'm coming from. I still think we should never, going back to my road rage, we should never underestimate our emotion in reacting to things. And that's what, in the end, drives politics and war. It's honor. I honestly touch.
Thank you very much indeed. Folks, I know we could go on all evening, and we probably could, but you have to get home, and please drive carefully, no road rage. Just 3 things from me, if I may, to bring to your attention. 16th of September, the exhibition on Frederick Kitten opens in the Museum of Galway.